In this video, I would like to talk to you about shyness, which is something I hear from a lot of teachers. They say to me after my workshops, they say, Jamie, you can tell stories, but I'm shy. What do I do? Well, I'm a bit shy too sometimes, maybe not quite as shy as the type of teacher that asks that question, but we can all suffer from it. And I think I've worked with so many teachers over the years that I've got some good advice to offer. So in this video, I'm going to give you 6 tips for working with your shyness, not overcoming your shyness, but for working with it. Just before we get started, here's 3 objects. What do they have in common? Number 1 is a courgette. Number 2 is some cheese. And number 3 is a bread roll. You may have noticed these items on the thumbnail. What do they have in common? We'll come to that later. Tip number 1, it's all about how you see it. Now, I think that when a lot of people think about storytelling, and we're considering specifically storytelling here in the classroom, telling stories to your students, but when a lot of people think about storytelling, they think about kind of stage performances. They think about presenters, maybe TED Talks or stand-up comedians. And I think it's really, really important to remember that when we're telling a story to our students, it's a kind of more akin to conversational storytelling. You know, I mean, every single human being on the planet has at some time, probably quite recently, shared a story with a friend in casual conversation over a coffee, that sort of thing. We've all done it. I think that's a really healthy way to look at it. As teachers, as language teachers, we're teaching communication, and this is a fundamental function of communication, is telling stories, starting with this very informal situations, this very informal context. Think of storytelling as being conversational. And when you get that image in your mind, I think it takes off a lot of the pressure, a lot of the stress that you would think otherwise if you think you had to go up to your students, maybe stand at the front of the class, say, hey students, I'm going to tell you a story, which is putting far too much pressure on yourself. So see it just as an extension of what you already do on a day-to-day basis with your students, which is quite simply speak with them. That's number 1. Okay. Number 2, keep it short. This is another thing I come to kind of understand from teachers that have these questions. They're often thinking about speaking to their students, telling a story which is going to last maybe 10 or 15 minutes. That's not what I'm considering. For me, the shorter the story, the better. And the shorter the story, the easier it is to keep our students' attention, and the shorter the story, the less there is to go wrong. I think that's what it's all about. One of the things I advocate is for teachers to introduce topics or create contexts using our own personal stories, rather than, for example, turn to a video to do the job for us. And obviously, we don't want to be filling the classroom with our own stories, with our own teacher talk. So keep it short, keep it snappy, keep it curiosifying, making sure that your students want to hear it. But that really is coming down to the shorter, the better. Number 3, unremarkable. You know, I think another thing that teachers have in their minds when they ask this question is that they say, I don't have any stories to tell, thinking that stories have to be remarkable. And for me, it's not about that. It's not about telling better stories. It's about telling stories better, taking those experiences that you already have and seeing how to structure them better and tell them better. You know, the more unremarkable a story is, the more potential it has to resonate with people. And I think that's important. The more unremarkable it is, the more likely it is that students will find their own meaning within it. Let me give you an example here. Imagine the course book topic of the day is food. I've never seen a course book that doesn't have food in it. Now, why would anyone ever want to turn to YouTube as a way to introduce the topic of food? I just don't know. I would tell a story like this. It would just this is true, but it didn't happen to me just yesterday. It happened a few weeks ago. I was working here in my home, and it was lunchtime. and I was hungry, which is kind of usual, isn't it, for lunchtime? The lunchtime alarm bell rang, that rumbling in my tummy, so I went into my kitchen, only to find that I had absolutely nothing in it. There was nothing in the cupboard, there was nothing in the fridge, except for a courgette, some cheese, specifically Manchego cheese, and a bread roll. So what did I do? Can you guess what I made, what I created? I made a courgette sandwich. And I wonder, if you were to create a courgette sandwich, how would you prepare the courgettes? Would you grill them, or would you fry them? What about the cheese? Would you slice it? Would you grate it? Let me show you my invention. This is it right here. I wonder what you think. What do you think of Jamie's lunch? Would you like this? Would you eat it? What do you think? It's healthy? I'm not so sure. There was a lot of olive oil in it and maybe too much cheese. But there you go. That is maybe one of the most unremarkable stories I can imagine. And yet, how meaningful is that? It's the story of one man's lunch. So I think that really does, in my mind, push this idea that stories do not have to be remarkable. It's not about telling better stories, it's about telling stories better. So number 4, what's number 4? Number 4, now, taking the pressure off yourself to tell a story is not saying to your students, I want to tell you a story. Those words marking the story which is coming are going to put you in the spotlight and are going to make you feel stressed. And so we don't want to use those words. What we look for when we're telling a story is a nice way in, a seamless way in. Students don't know that you're going to tell them a story. But then once you've passed this way in, they want to hear it. I gave you an example there. I gave you 3 objects. I gave you a courgette, some cheese, and a bread roll. I asked you to guess what these things have in common. Ask that question to your students. They're never going to guess the answer. Maybe they're going to say it could be a sandwich. But the answer is, okay, let me tell you what they had. Let me tell you what these 3 ingredients have in common. Okay, yesterday it was time for lunch. I walked into my kitchen. You're now telling the story, but you've got your students who are actually very curious to hear it. It's a short story coming, it's unremarkable, and not once are you putting yourself in the spotlight by saying, hey students, let me tell you a story. You're finding a way in which is curiosifying. Your students now want to hear the story, even if they don't realize there's a story coming. They want to know what these items have in common. Now it's time for you to supply the answer, to tell that story. That was number 4. Number 5. Nobody ever told me this. This is the secret to successful storytelling. Good storytellers make it look kind of almost effortless. But behind every good story that's told is preparation. You have to think about your story. You have to think about how you're going to prepare it. How are you going to set it up? What's your way in? In my case, it was to give you these 3 items, these 3 ingredients. There were some questions. How would you prepare the courgette? How would you prepare the cheese? What do you think of my lunch now you've seen it? Rate it. Do you think it's healthy or not? You know, take some time over your language choices. What's important? What's not important? The details. Sometimes we give too much information. And the questions in this case. And there was also a photograph in this case, which was I think, very important to the story. So prepare your stories. If you're enjoying this video, if I could just trouble you to give it a cheeky little thumbs up, maybe even subscribe to the channel, make a man happy, I'd really appreciate that. And number 6, use notes if you have to. No one ever said that storytelling has to be done without notes. I've made this mistake myself when I've told stories in conferences, to think I have to do it without notes, only to mess everything up. And there's no shame ever in having notes in your hand. I'm not talking here about reading an entire scripted story from your notes like this. You know, that's not what it's about. It's about maybe something more brief, maybe bullet points, and even if you are using a whole text, eyes up, eyes down at the notes, eyes up at your students. You want to be speaking with them. You don't want to be reading from a text. That's the important thing. So those are my 6 storytelling tips for shy teachers. I made a video a while ago which is the 3 essential ingredients for a story. There's a bit of overlap with this one, but I would really recommend it. You can watch it here. All right, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you next Wednesday. Bye-bye.